Hey there, I'm Molly, and you're listening to the It's All Connected podcast, where we talk about life, business, finances, travel, health, spirituality, and how it's all connected. This podcast is for you if you want real and relatable content that makes you feel like you're having coffee or drinks with a friend. You ready? Let's dive in. Hey there, question for you. Do you ever feel like you have a ton of ideas, but you're not sure what to do first? Like maybe you want to start a business or start a new business or start a side project, create a podcast, write a book, travel, create a digital product, whatever it is, whether it's related to life or business or, your passions. Maybe you want to start a YouTube channel or a TikTok, but you're like, well, which one do I focus on first? Because there are so many things. And so you keep thinking about it and waiting and thinking about it. And weeks pass by and then months start to pass by and then a whole year passes by. And you're like, oh crap, I still haven't done anything yet. In this podcast episode today, I wanted to share what I do and how I decide what to work on first, but also how to actually bring those ideas to life, because I know it's like to be stuck in that analysis paralysis and feeling that overwhelm and stress when you feel like there are so many things that you want to do, you're not sure what to do first. And then once you decide what you actually want to do, you're like, well, how do I actually get started? And then you think ahead and you're like, oh, there's so many things to do. And then you kind of talk yourself out of it, right? Or at least that's kind of what happens for me sometimes. And so this is something that I want to talk about and share, and hopefully you get some golden nuggets out of this podcast episode today. So what I like to do, first of all, I am a total paper and pen type of person. So I like to make a mind map or just brain dump. Normally I do brain dumps, but lately I've been really into mind maps, and it's basically where you write down a word and then you draw these arrows and then you just kind of branch out. And I feel that I get so many ideas whenever I just write things down. And I think the key is not judging yourself or not coming up with the reasons of, oh, I can't do this or this would be too hard. Take everything out of that and just write down the ideas that you have. And then you can process it and prioritize and go through them later on. And so that's the first step, is just write it. Don't overthink it. Write down everything that you want to do. And then what I do next is I'll look at it and I'll be like, oh, these things are really important to me. These are the things I really want to do. And the other ones are just kind of ideas that I had maybe floating by, or maybe someone once mentioned it and I'm like, oh, that'd be cool. Or sometimes there's things that I want to do later on, but it might not be something that I want to do necessarily in the moment. And so then I can start categorizing them, right? I could be like, okay, these are things I want to focus later on in life, but these are the other things that I want to focus on right now that could help me with those things later on in life. So for example, some of the things that I want to do are I want to start this podcast, which I'm currently recording this episode. So yay. I want to write a book. I want to host retreats in the future. And I might even want to start my own co-working, co-living community somewhere. But they all kind of group together, but I don't have to do them all at once, right? Having the podcast and having the book might help me with the two other things later on, which the retreats and having the co-living co-working space. So I categorize it in that way of, okay, is this a current thing or a long-term thing, or is this a daily thing that I have to work on? And if so, what are the things that I have to work on a daily basis or weekly basis? But before we get there, one other thing that I do is I write down what is the intention behind each of the things that I want to work on. So for example, why do I want to have this podcast? What's the purpose and goal behind the podcast? And for me, one of the main reasons why I wanted to start this podcast is actually because I want to practice using my voice again, because for the past few years, I have just not said a lot of things that I wanted to say. In fact, I, at one point, or a very long point, just did not know what to say, to the point where I just felt so lost and directionless. And I'm like, what am I doing? And I was just, well, I don't want to keep saying the word lost, but I just felt so lost. And so this podcast is really a way for me to reconnect with myself again. But I also feel like I've learned a lot in the past few years, and I want to share some of that that might be helpful for you. Or maybe you're also going through the same thing, and that will help you feel less alone, because I know that sometimes you feel like you're alone and maybe you feel like you're the only one going through what you're going through. And when I find that a lot of people can actually relate, but because maybe you feel, embarrassed, or maybe you feel like, oh, why is this only happening to me, until you isolate yourself, until you feel like you're more alone in that way. But I just want to remind you that you're not alone, and it's okay. It's okay to like take things like one day at a time. You don't have to figure out all right now, and to give yourself that compassion and the patience and kindness and all of those things that my previous therapist kept reminding me of every week, just like reminding me of to be more compassionate and kind towards myself. And so that's something that I've been working on. I just went off on a long tangent. Yeah. So what is your intention behind each of these things? Like my intention behind, you know, writing the book is, again, like using my voice, but also I want to create additional income for myself, right? I want to also just practice getting my thoughts out there again. And I feel like, I've always enjoyed writing in the past. So I was like, oh, what a cool way to both express myself, but also help other people. So I'm currently working on a book helping people plan their travels or become a digital nomad. I'm not really sure what yet, but something along the lines of traveling. And so after you have your major things down, like go to each of them and then write down, okay, what is my intention for this? How is this going to help me? And it doesn't always have to be so serious, right? If you just want to have fun with it, then just have fun with it. I think that's important too. Like I feel like when we take everything so seriously and we take the joy out of it, we're like, oh, we have to do this thing, instead of, oh, I get to do these things. These things like bring me joy. These things make me excited. And so that's something that I'm working on with this podcast of like, okay, don't like take it so seriously. Don't try to always strategize everything. Just go with the flow and do like what works for you and do what feels good to you. And so since I have a lot of things that I personally want to work on, like I want to get back on Instagram. I want to do this podcast. I want to start an email list again, write a book, maybe go on TikTok. I'm currently working on my health, like both, or not both, my mental, physical, and just like spiritual health. And then I am currently recording from Malaysia. So I found this super awesome studio that does like breath work and healing circles and yoga meditations. It's been so amazing. I go there, I think about 3 to 4 times a week. I spend a lot of time there. Actually, I got their unlimited monthly pass, and it has just been so helpful in my healing and growth. So my intention behind that is obviously to work on myself and also just like release a lot of the things that I've been holding on to in the past few years, because I know I've been holding on to a lot, and I want to create room and intention for new things to come in. Something else that I want to work on is reading more. And, like I said, there's a lot of things going on. So making sure that you're not trying to do all of them all at once. So I'm giving myself like time blocks of, okay, I'm going to work on my podcast first, which then relates to Instagram. TikTok is for later on. And so, you start to work through them and you pick the ones that are most important to you. So I picked the podcast first because it felt like the path of least resistance. For me, it felt like one of the easier paths to work on. And so, which I'm going to admit, probably not that easy, but is like easy enough, I guess. And it's also something that I'm working on. I feel like it's in alignment with the breath work and healing circles and meditations I've been doing, because in the healing circles, you share things to other people. And I've noticed that in the beginning, I didn't want to share anything. Like I was afraid of when it would become my turn. And then I feel like I always have two answers that I'm like, quote unquote, ready to share with the class. My safe answer and then my real answer. And I've been pushing myself or challenging myself lately to give my real answer. And I'm afraid sometimes to share my real answer because I'm like, well, what if it sounds dumb? Or what if like other people, are like, what is she saying? But I think one of the things that I'm working on is voicing my thoughts and my opinions and what I think without outside judgment or even like inner judgment, because I do judge myself a lot. Okay, so the third thing that I do, and I kind of mentioned this earlier, is I prioritize them. So, what's important in the list of things? Like, is this something that you need to focus on now? Or is this something you can focus on later? Because if you have a lot of ideas, you're probably like, oh, I want to work on everything right now. And so maybe you make a plan of like working on everything right now, but then it's so overwhelming that you actually don't do it. And then you end up in the cycle of like wanting to do things and not doing them. And then you feel like you're incapable because, you keep not doing them. And I feel like when that happens, you create this story of like, oh, I can't do this, it's too hard, etc. Like, and then you start to believe these things, right? And then it's like this cycle that just keeps on going over and over again. So my suggestion would be to, okay, let's pick a few things and then let's do them. So once you pick your thing, what I like to do is I break it down into very simple action steps. So, for example, with this podcast, I was like, okay, I need to come up with a podcast name. I also need to come up with who this podcast is for. I need to write a podcast description, write down my podcast titles, create a cover page, or not cover page, podcast cover image. And for each of the podcast episodes I write down, I need to do talking points for them. So I wrote all of those steps down so that I could be like, okay, I have the name. I have the podcast description. I know who it's for. I've thought of these amount of podcast ideas, and these are the ones I want to talk about first. And then I have the talking points. And so I do these in steps, sometimes I do them all at once, but sometimes I don't. I just, whatever gets done. And I try not to judge myself for it. But what I find is that if you take the first couple of steps, the momentum builds, right? But then you need to know what those steps are, because if you're just like, okay, I'm just going to start a podcast, and then you start doing, and then you don't have a list in front of you and you're like, oh, I have to do this, and then I have to do that, and then I have to do the other thing. And sometimes we feel overwhelmed when we feel like we have so many things that we have to do. And then again, you don't do any of it. And so whenever someone asks you, they're like, oh, what happened to that podcast you were starting? And then you have to like repeat the story of how you haven't done it yet. And I don't know about you, but I personally don't like that. So I kind of don't tell people what it is that I'm doing until I have decided in my mind that I am doing it. So once I've decided, personally for me, once I've decided that I am going to be doing something, I'm like fully committed. I'm like, this is getting done. I don't know when it's getting done. But what I will do is I will then pick a date and then I reverse engineer from that date. So I'm like, okay, I'm going to release this podcast in March. I actually haven't picked a date yet because I just wasn't sure like of some other things. But let's say I'm going to launch this podcast on March 1st, right? I'm just picking a random day. Then that means that I have to get these things done by that date. Like I have to decide on what my podcast episodes are going to be about so that I can actually record them. And then you can say, okay, this is the amount of time that I need to record my podcast so that I can also send them off to editing so that I can schedule them. So it's not just one big overwhelming task that's like, oh, start a podcast. Right. And so that's what I like to do. I like to break things down so that I know exactly what it is that I am working on. So I'm not scrambling to get things together, or it's not just this idea that I continue to have in my head, because if you're like, oh, I want to start this thing, but you don't know what the steps are, I have found that it's very hard to continue on with that thing because everything just feels like scattered and disorganized. So, it's almost like tax season, and that's something that I have avoided for the longest time. I don't know why, because we go through this every single year, and I was just like, I knew I needed to email my CPA all of the documents I needed to send her, and I just kept avoiding it, and I was like, okay, I just need to write a list down. I'm like very into list making, and once I had that list down, I could just check things off, and I would break it down into the simplest things, like, okay, she needs this document and this document, and these are all the questions that I want to ask her, and these are like all of the action items. And I found that that's the best way for me to actually get things done, because whenever I send things to CPA, I will avoid it until I literally can't avoid it anymore. Well, that's not true. I actually will not wait until like the last possible minute to do that, because that will just cause so much stress, and I'm not into that. But I will like wait until the last minute that I know that I can wait, if that makes sense. So I'm a very big fan of just writing down all of your action steps and being able to like check things off as you go along. And again, you don't need to do everything right now, right? I think that's one of the biggest lessons I've learned in 2022 is you can zoom out and look at the whole picture. Like, you don't have to be like, oh, this has to be done as quickly as possible. It's a marathon or an ultra marathon and not a sprint that you're doing. Give your ideas time to come to fruition. Give your ideas time to actually become something, and don't give yourself such a short deadline of, reaching whatever your goals are. And remember to celebrate your wins whenever you have them, whether they're big or small. Like, celebrate when you have your book idea, or when you've written down your outline, or, simple things. It doesn't have to be, oh, I can only celebrate it once I've written my book, or once I have my first X amount of sales. And yeah, I just find that it's better whenever we celebrate ourselves and we're proud of ourselves, and we recognize that the things that we're doing, because otherwise I feel like we're just more harsh on ourselves and judging ourselves, and it doesn't make us feel good, right? Like, I don't know about you, but I want to create from a space that feels good, from a space that feels encouraging, rather than listening to like my inner critic or inner mean voice and all of that stuff. So hopefully you found this podcast episode helpful. You have an idea of like, okay, if you have a ton of things that you want to work on, how to choose one, like, again, what is the most important for you? What makes the most sense for you? Like, what's the intention behind the thing that you want to do? And does it support the other things that you want to do, right? Or more importantly, maybe the better question to ask is, does this support my long-term vision, my overarching vision that I'm working on, or the things I want to do? Like, does it support that? And then once you decide what are those things that you want to work on, then make a list of, okay, these are the things I actually have to do to get those done. So these are the things I have to do to launch the podcast. These are the things I have to do to get the book done. And these are the things I have to do to get back on Instagram. And you have your top 3 things. I like to do things in threes because I feel like it's manageable. No, I said that's a lot. Like, it's manageable, and you also feel like you're getting things done, and you also like can do different things, right? I find that's more fun sometimes when we get to work on different projects, or I don't know, maybe that's just me. So yeah, I hope that you found this episode helpful. And if you need help figuring this out, or you want help bring your idea to life, like maybe you do want to create a digital product, or you want to create a course, or you're planning to launch something, I am actually opening up a few one-on-one mentorship spots on my calendar. Over the years, I've helped a lot of entrepreneurs and business owners bring their ideas to life, bring their digital products and course ideas to life. And I've also helped with marketing plans, launches, etc. And one thing that I've learned about myself is that I really love problem solving. If you have a problem, I want to come up with a solution. So if you would like to get some help, or, if you've been following me for a while and you've been thinking about wanting to work together, I'm going to drop my link in the show notes to where you can learn more about what that looks like and what it would be like to work together and how to book a call with me. And if you found today's episode helpful, I'd love to hear from you on Instagram. Send me a DM at Molly Studio and say hi. Also, make sure to subscribe to the It's All Connected podcast so that you can get notified of future podcast episodes. I know those were a lot of call to actions, so just pick whichever one that resonates with you most, and I'll talk to you soon. Okay, bye.